OD&I was operating under the findings of the 9/11 Commission, which had noted that, both the FBI and CIA particularly, but other agencies as well, were not sharing information with one another. And had they shared the information they have, they could have prevented 9/11 seamlessly. It probably never would have reached the PDB level. They could have just resolved it. But because of old rivalries between intel and law enforcement, they didn't share.
So today we are speaking to Carson Checketts, a former US Navy officer and national security professional who has spent much of his career working across the US intelligence community and Department of Defense. His experience has taken him through intelligence, analysis and collection, policy, mission assurance, and more recently his work has taken him to DC and working on the Hill. Along the way, he studied law, international relations and national security, and he's written on a very wide range of subjects ranging from information operations and intelligence oversight to artificial intelligence and the increasingly complicated relationship between humans, machines and information. So Carson, that's quite a journey and that's quite a broad set of subjects. So I guess maybe take us, why the Navy? How did you get started? And maybe let's start off the journey there, if that's okay.
Oh, I appreciate it, of course. Yeah. That was a very kind introduction, Mark. I will just say that, in reality, I am just a lost farm boy that ended up in DC. After 9/11 happened, I saw it live when I was still an undergrad. I really felt the call to serve. And I enlisted in the Marine Corps and enlisted and then eventually joined the ROTC program there in Utah. So it took 28 credit hours to kind of get to boot camp as fast as possible. And really enjoyed my time down in Quantico with the Marine Corps. After that, I went to law school up at Roger Williams in Rhode Island and studied national security law and did a Pentagon internship and was selected to be commissioned in the Navy as a JAG officer, which started in fall of 2006. So, so from there, things just kind of moved forward. Life is never as predictable as we think it is.
And am I right in thinking that from a training point of view, into like a doctrine, your understanding of intelligence with a big I, that was probably from a more militaristic route, I guess, in terms of definitions and practices and what intelligence was, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of think about it. I always thought, I saw some James Bond movies, back when I was younger, but I guess I never really thought that it was, I don't know what I thought about it before. I guess I really didn't think about it much, right? In law school. And then, I just kind of, when I got recruited by OD&I, it kind of opened my eyes to that, and the specific program, I just want to mention that, well, first I want to ask you guys, how common is knowing about intel over in the UK? How did you gentlemen come to law enforcement and intel?
I think I might have said this on air before. It's funny you mentioned James Bond, but basically, so my story very swiftly was, I grew up wanting to be a police officer. However, what happened along the way, as you can see on camera, I have glasses, and in the UK at the time, we have certain standards that you have to have a certain level of eyesight to become a serving police officer. And my eyesight deteriorated in my late teens, and it basically meant that was not going to be an option. And so I had my career plans pivoted massively. And I thought I was going to get a job in IT. But then when I learned that there was a civilian branch of the UK police that you could join, and like you, my entire notion of intel was James Bond, just kind of a completely fictionalized. I had no notion of how intel worked. It wasn't until I actually joined West Yorkshire Police, which is the organisation that both me and Howard are from, that I kind of got my introduction to the intel world proper. And here we are. Howard?
Yeah, as you'll see from the images, I'm a lot older than Mark, so I predate him. I was already a serving officer in the police, just a normal law enforcement officer, and I became a detective. I trained as a scientist. My first degree was in science, but I couldn't make a living in that, so the police was, as a young chap, that was a safe career to go into. And I loved it, but the police is driven by information. And during that process, my scientific discipline and skills, a bit like your legal or military discipline and skills, I found meant I could do my job as an investigator better. And then I got the chance, quite out of the blue, to go on a training course in the USA for law enforcement intel. I was one of the first in the UK. And I went on that, and that opened my eyes, because up to that point, I would use normal scientific research methods or evidence-based record systems that the police already used.
Interesting. Was that like an FBI MI5 type thing, or?
It was a private company that the American military actually had asked to develop this. The company was called Anacapa Life Sciences from Santa Barbara. And they used to do like the time and motion study for the decision tree for launching a nuclear missile from a US submarine, for example. That was kind of their skill set. And they designed this. It was only a 2-week course for law enforcement. And that became the base training platform for most of law enforcement. This is back in 1983-4. Brought that back to the UK, which had opened my eyes, and then had to rewrite it and adapt it to become suitable for UK and European policing rather than the US style of policing and law enforcement. I've always been a student, even now that I'm quasi-retired, I'm learning new stuff every day. I have to understand things and break them apart and figure out how they work to make them work better or to use them effectively as a tool. So
that's excellent. I mean, I have to say, I noted that you said to make a living, you had to become a police officer, which is equally noble that you raised your hand and have served. I mean, law enforcement is so important, as you know.
I've always, a bit like you, if you're going to do something in life, make a difference. Now, I don't care if it happens to be that you want to go into business and make profit. Good luck to you. But do it well. And in my case, I wanted to serve the public. I wanted to serve people. I did that in my science career. I worked for a charity doing heart transplant research of all things. But that idea of duty, it mattered to me to make a difference and leave a bit of a legacy. But once I'd been to America, I made a circle of friends. I started researching in depth, rewrote the course to make it better from my scientific knowledge and UK law enforcement. And then we started we became the training provider for the UK, my force, and for most of Europe and even back to America, ironically. I ended up, I've trained students from these days, probably about 50 countries.
Wow. You mentioned something about turning the US law enforcement style in the course to the UK European style. What's sort of the difference there?
Well, in the US, it's far more layered. In the UK, wherever you go, there are 43 territorial police forces. And obviously, it's a much smaller place. You can fit the UK into Texas.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, geography works for us.
Goodness, what are you guys eating over there? You've conquered the world a couple times and you're the size of Texas. We have more to learn.
Yeah. We used to punch above our weight. These days, we're just a third world country, but we are what we are.
We were just looking for tea.
But
you are a key ally. You were certainly a key ally.
Wherever I learned my lesson. I went for my first training course to the Texas DPS Training Center in Austin, Texas. And it was my first time in the US. And I went there, and on that campus, or if you walked around Austin in Texas, there was something like 40 law enforcement organizations you might encounter, from highway patrol to sheriffs to local police departments, state police, FBI, DEA, all these kind of, you thought, well, which one's the police? Because here, if you see a police officer, whether you be in Scotland or in our hometown, it's the same everywhere. And they are regionally managed, a bit like state police, but there's a much more coherent national structure. And that's actually quite useful if you're wanting to influence policy and training and recruiting and the way that you integrate intelligence into things. And Europe's far more like the UK in that than North America as a whole. You and Canada are very much peas in the same pod. You have these wide varieties of organizations. It's good for variety, but it's a problem for policy when you're trying to make a one-size-fits-all for every organization that has its own remit in terms of serving the public. But that's
so interesting. No, I mean, you bring up a good point. I remember learning, after 9/11, President Bush went to the FBI director at the time, and he said, 9/11 happened, terrorism is going to be a problem. We don't have the equivalent of an MI5 here in the States, but we're going to need it. And so the policy option on the table that had been presented to Bush was sort of course one, double the size of the FBI, at least perhaps triple it, so that it could keep its federal law enforcement and then do a lot of counterterrorism work, or create a new organization from whole cloth, which became the Department of Homeland Security. And unfortunately, at least from my perspective, the FBI director at the time did not want to, Mueller did not want to expand the FBI. He thought it was sort of too exclusive to grow that big, right? I know there's always you want to recruit the best and brightest. And so he was afraid of diluting the FBI culture. So here we are with DHS, which is a different story. But I think there are some advantages to what you said about having a single police force. That's got to be much easier to integrate all the missions.
That's the point. From a policy structure and for a kind of a pyramidal management process, it reminds me of the military. Although the military is very diverse, and in the case of the US, the paramount military force in the world, I hate to think of the levels and structures, but I guarantee whatever rank you achieved, you could go to a base anywhere in the world, and those people on that base would recognize your uniform, your rank, and your authority, and react.
Absolutely.
That discipline structure is a good structure for having combined business activity or integrated business activity. And whenever I've gone around the world to other countries that are, shall we say, emerging in those fields, and I'm going back over 50 years, I've loved to be able to go, because these people are just as intelligent as us, if not more intelligent, but they have different problems. But you can go and share the advantages and different disadvantages of different business processes. And of course, ultimately, you want each of these countries and organizations to find ways to collaborate and cooperate when we have common interests internationally. And the system has to work. You can't have using an old example, a VHS intelligence system in Eastern Europe and a Betamax intelligence system in Asia. And two systems can talk to each other effectively.
So well said. So well said. I tell you, we had to, this is sort of a different topic, but it related here. The Office of Naval Intelligence, when I was working on the Navy staff over there for the Pentagon and the intel world, we found out that we weren't sort of complying with statutes as written. Like, you have to, in the U.S., you have to have an oversight organization, what we call an Echelon 2, above, an intel center, and ONI is just a center. So we stood up what they call Naval Intelligence Activity as part of OPNAV N2. Speaking of how organizations interact, right? In military, the 2 does intel, the 3 does ops, and so on. 1 does personnel. And so under N2 and 6, which we had combined to create information warfare in the Navy, a change that's since been undone just recently. But we stood up Naval Intelligence Activity, and we had to eventually silo ourselves into the N1, N2, N3 structure. And we also had ONI reorganize themselves to correspond the same, because people had a very difficult time differentiating, are you the Pentagon staff? Are you from Suitland? These sort of things. So, and you mentioned something else too, Howard, that I'd love to get Mark's take on. You mentioned the uniformed police are the same across the UK. I worked on Capitol Hill recently, and although I was focused on foreign affairs, one of the kind of knotty issues in terms of a wicked problem we have is just this knot of policy plus perception. And with DHS now and ICE having, sort of the legal authorities the FBI used to have exclusively, right? And also absorbing some domestic police responsibilities, I think it's hard in the U.S. to even know whether people are law enforcement or not, right? There's these incidents where people are approached and they think they're getting kidnapped,
It's just in the same way that if you see a member of the military personnel from any country, they're the real military. But what do you do when you see somebody in combat fatigues wearing a cap and loads of badges and carrying, a military weapon and maybe even driving a military-esque looking vehicle? What nobody realizes, and this includes politicians, our organizations operate in a position of privilege to support the public. We are there to serve our nations and every individual citizen within that, whether it be to protect or defend. There's very little difference between the perspective and the philosophy of the military to law enforcement.
So well said. But they're very close cousins. I mean, they're in the same family in my mind.
Well, I've had some of my best jobs working with colleagues in the military who could only share a certain amount with me in my position with my security clearance in law enforcement, although it was the top of law enforcement. But sometimes just knowing that you can pick up the phone or make contact with somebody and say, if I asked you this, would you be able to answer me? That's gold. It's the kind of business information that you could not have without these relationships. But whilst we have that and we're on the inside and we all know, how do the public know? How do the people who perceive us? So you mentioned the DHS and ICE. I watched that. If they were wearing it for ICE, if they were wearing a badge that says only ICE, fine. Then ICE, those individuals in that organisation can be held accountable for how they behave, the same as any police officer. But when you see them wearing police, that really upsets me, because I am worried that the people who are seeing them don't know whether they are police or ICE or Homeland Security or anything else. They've changed kind of the markers. But secondly, they're actually misrepresenting to people because they think it's the police. I mean, over here, we don't have anything like those complex organizations, thankfully.
So well said. You're right. And, as you get more involved in policy, those titles matter. It's not just tradition, right? Like, police means something. It means you're our local guys, my community, right? You can stop me on the street and ask me something, happy to help you out. But if you find out that person's actually ICE and all this stuff, and they're looking for immigrants, it is a misrepresentation. And I think sort of a break in the tradition of law enforcement that does not serve us well.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I'm not competent to comment on what's going on in the USA. I watch it as a fan of the US and a friend of the US and somebody who's worked there for all of my law enforcement career and since, and even now. And it worries me and upsets me from my UK perspective. But I have the same concerns, frankly, with things that are going on over here and in places other than the US. So it's not just a US problem. This is a system problem about the relationship between these people who serve the public, the society, and society itself. We are in danger of breaching that contract. Look at the American military traditions. They are just like the UK. If you serve in the American military, you become part of the proverbial band of brothers. And that's a standard and a relationship built on history of great events and much sacrifice.
Absolutely.
And goes beyond it, impacts on your family, on your friends, on your values and everything else, whether you be retired, young, old, whichever branch. And it's the same in a way in law enforcement. I every day I go out, and if I see somebody in law enforcement locally doing something that I disagree with or in a scruffy uniform, I politely speak to them or I ring what is their version of a commanding officer, because usually I'm so old, I probably trained them or I've known them in my career when they were,
Howard, I tell you what, I can still visualize you as a drill instructor telling these recruits how to, how to keep their hair squared away and reminding them of the law. It matters.
You look at the US Marine and that spit and polish, sharp image, that commands respect. And if you mention the word US Marine, I guarantee you anybody in the world would visualize, have an image in their head of what those people are and what they stand for. The moment you change the structure of that uniform or devalue the culture in any way, you are doing a disservice, not just to the people who are there now and who've gone before, you're doing a disservice to the principles of what you're trying to achieve and the people that you serve.
That is so well said. And, and you're certainly not criticizing something here, that is not common to our cultures. I have a lot of friends in the FBI that are both agents and analysts, more than I know they're agents. And all of them are prior military, and all of them, exception to maybe one or two, have expressed, I would call it, it really is anger at how ICE is portraying law enforcement. Because the FBI goes through this intensive academy. I believe it's 6 months now. I saw one of my fraternity brothers graduate down there. They get their family, the guy's wife there, and everyone comes. The director speaks down at Quantico. They get their badge issued. They get their first gun. It's a big ceremony after they've mastered, U.S. domestic law.
The public, half the members of society, and it's not just about ICE and it's not just about the USA. It's global, is this? And regardless of any agency serving the public, they have to have trust repaid for the trust that they place in you. And particularly in our world, where we're dealing with some serious, nation-threatening issues or personal issues that threaten individuals in the case of law enforcement or terrorism. But we're also doing things and saying to the people, trust us. We can't show you what we actually do all the time because there's a necessary element of secrecy here. Otherwise, we're giving away tradecraft and information to potential competitors or foes. But that trust is only as good as them being able to trust us as guardians and gatekeepers and keeping faith. And when you have rules that the public know about, they have a right to expect you to stand to those rules. And when you don't, what you don't realise is it might be a good short-term remedy or political or other convenience for the moment. But when that becomes a carte blanche, and this isn't a US issue, it's global, you risk breaking that bond of trust and faith that you have with the people you're there to serve, no matter what your intentions are.
Well said. So well said. And, the American people, in my experience, I really agree with how both President G.W. Bush and how President Obama view them. I mean, it's really a humble culture, right? I mean, the average American, if they see a police officer or military officer, they either stop and thank them or, there's respect and, deference to them. Right. They're held up as a model for society. And so I think you're absolutely right, Howard. That's what we need to maintain, is this respect for law enforcement officers. So when you see that uniform, they're there to serve the public and to help you.
You're right, but you also need respect for the rules-based system that you've built for education. Right. If you cannot trust these people to do what you've given them the power to do, and they're not going to tell you full details. It's kind of like going to a doctor. Take it away from law enforcement and the military into another public service. A professional doctor may not tell you what they found, the detail of the tests and why they're significant. But if they say, look, if you don't have this treatment, you're probably going to die or be seriously ill, there's an element of trust there that they're going to hold your data in confidence and be altruistic. They're not just going to think, well, I can make money out of this dude by selling him treatment he doesn't need. That kind of,
Right.
What I'm worried about is any breach of trust in that public system actually undermines the society for short-term political or financial convenience or covering up a mistake. I'm all for bending the rules with the greatest of respect to any of these agencies. I don't know what the political, financial, organisational, personal pressures are within them that might excuse some of their behaviour. We're all human beings at the end of the day. But that's why we have rules and processes, so that individual failings get picked up and hopefully either elite. That's part of the intel process. We're here not to just innovate with new ideas and ways forward proactively, but also to risk manage and to defend against the unknown and the scary from outside our current knowledge base.
So well said. And, I think it's one of those things where, oftentimes, in cultures, and you see this throughout history, all democracies, I'm going to say all that I've dealt with in republics, we sort of, cross little lines on occasion. And then sometimes you cross a bigger line, the agencies do, or the, law enforcement. And then there's almost always kind of a whiplash correction, right? You saw this with the church and pike committees, which I think was a severe overcorrection. But, in the U.S., when there's apparently accusations, I still maintain they were never proven. People treat history like it's done. But, but if you actually look into it, I don't think the accusations against the agency were well based. But regardless of that, the perception was that there was an overreaching of our laws against American citizens' privacy rights. And so there was a congressional committee to resolve it. And in this case, we see now with ICE doing what they're doing and definitely making other FBI and other domestic agencies feel like ICE is not representing them well. It is definitely a problem. But I wanted to mention too, Howard, you mentioned something about recruiting and being able to call someone. You'd call a friend, when you spent time in the U.S., another agency to say, hey, if we were to have this issue, could we perhaps get some assistance with that? And I think that highlights two really important things. One is that, the government is just like every other human organization, right? I think that, sometimes people think, especially in the U.S., that, back in D.C., these feds are doing X, Y, Z. I still remember when Sarah Palin she wasn't trying to be humorous, but she said, everyone in D.C. has a hot tub in the backyard and, drives a Lexus or, a Bentley. And so people have this image of it being that way. But, we're just people, from across the country, here to do whatever the country needs. So, yeah, I think that knowing people in other agencies is crucial. And that's actually why they created that OD&I program I had mentioned back that Mark asked about how I got an intel. OD&I was operating under the findings of the 9/11 Commission, which had noted that, both the FBI and CIA particularly, but other agencies as well, were not sharing information with one another. And had they shared the information they have, they could have prevented 9/11 seamlessly. It probably never would have reached the PDB level. Of course it reached the PDB level, as we all know now, but they could have just resolved it. But because of old rivalries between Intel and law enforcement, they didn't share. And, it's unfortunate. So they created this OD&I program that I was in called National Security and Summer Seminar. And the intent was to get 40 students from across the country, geographically dispersed, some military guys. We had some, law enforcement guys, even local cops that had applied, and get them together and teach them the basics of analysis, including law enforcement. Because, law enforcement, as you both know, it is a form of intelligence and information, right? And I think the sort of distinction between what is intel versus what is information has really broken down. It's sort of like, everything can be considered intelligence or everything can be considered information. And, at this point, one of our former directors, I believe it was Director Cardillo, said on a recent podcast that 90% of the data that the intel community uses is open source. It's no different from what everybody has on google.com or whatever your chosen browser is, Microsoft Bing or the like. And it's only that 10%, that must be kept confidential. And so increasingly, there's less and less of sort of a respect paid to sort of the secret sauce of intel, right? So, you see these private intel firms and private companies who sort of create their own methods of finding out what's happening over in the UK, or happening over in China. And there's really no reason, at the end of the day, in my perspective, there's less and less of a reason. I should be careful in saying that. There's less and less of a reason to think that only the government has the answer, right? Now it's broader. Anybody can have an informed opinion, though I do think intel plays a crucial role. So anyway, to finish my thought there, I know that was a bit of a rabbit hole, but the intent of that OD&I program was that we would be hired across all 18 elements of the intelligence community. And that happened. So we all got hired in different agencies. So, we needed to phone a friend over the idea, using the 9/11 metaphor. If this program had existed before 9/11, John Doe could have called Jane Doe and said, hey, we're tracking this Osama bin Laden guy. What do you guys have? And they would already have camaraderie, trust, pre-existing before they even came into the agencies. So anyway, just wanted to mention that detail.
No, Carson, I think you've raised so many really important points, and I hope I remember them all. I just want to go back and revisit a couple of things you said. The first thing I think you alluded to was this tension between information and intelligence. People who've been listening to podcasts for a while will realize that that's something me and Howard lean into very heavily on this show. We're not going to go into it here. We've got plenty of, we can do if you want to talk about it in a bit more detail, but I think that tension between info and intel is real. And when you say that the majority of intel, in inverted commas, is actually just information, I think is absolutely fundamental. And I think but I think it presses on another point, which I was going to talk to you about, because I imagine this has probably had an impact on your career directly, which is one thing we've come across as we spoke to different people from different walks of life, intel folk, be they military, be they state security, be they law enforcement, is that essentially, I think what's happened is sometimes, like your first big organization, it's like what kind of way you grow up, right? And you learn what these words mean, and they say, welcome to this organization. Intelligence is this. And a lot of times, intelligence is something very specific. It might be something technical. It might be cell site data. It might be something it might be something militaristic, but it's all very kind of, and quite rightly, we have to have operational security. We have to have secrets. We have to lock things down. That's fine. But it's usually very specialist people dealing with very specialist signals. So everything's kind of narrowed right down to fine detail. And I think what you're talking about in the post 9/11 world is actually, if this was a Venn diagram with all these different agencies and their own interpretations of intelligence, that overlap between the agencies and departments in some respects was quite small, because they'd kind of grown up around, and sorry, the point I'm trying to get to is, if you go back to Pearl Harbor, formation of CIA, this idea of I'm simplifying massively, so apologies to my intelligence historian colleagues, because I know I'm going to oversimplify this. But essentially, the big problem was, prior to CIA, the kind of silo and kind of internalization of intelligence, nobody sharing, everything's in a pigeonhole or a box somewhere, no one's talking to each other, everyone's got their own local way of thinking. Central intelligence agency, this idea of centralizing the intel So we've kind of got a one-stop shop. And God, you tell me, I think we've had fusion centers in the US going for like 20 years now, maybe longer.
Absolutely. And joint task forces and everything to overcome these gaps and seams you're referencing, Mark.
It seems to be that there's a fundamental tension there, right? Like for some reason, putting the jigsaw pieces together seems to be something that eludes us even when we set up dedicated institutions and structures to do that. Can you speak to that? Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. And, you raised a really good point. And I think this is sort of, let me think a moment. What I was going to say is that, when I think about what you mentioned and Mark and I's discussion just previous to this about how we respect law enforcement and police officers for a reason, right? They keep the community safe and have certain legal authorities. In the intelligence community, I think in a diligent effort, well-intentioned effort to ensure that each agency complies with the requisite federal laws, we have divided all the authorities associated with governance into completely different bins, right? So FBI has, let's say, its authority. Again, my legal friends will chastise me for not citing them all. Let's say that the FBI has the first 5 authorities, right, in the U.S. Code, right, in terms of law enforcement and whatnot. And then CIA is, of course, Title 50, and, most of the intel community is Title 50, and then the military is Title 10. But, when you get all these and you separate them into unique cultures, each with hundreds of years of tradition and with their own sort of perspective on the world, the problem we run into, Mark, on your original insight about sort of a Venn diagram of information being layered within information, is that individuals in each of those silos and cultures it's not just that they don't look at the world the same, they're not given the same information, which naturally decides the world they live in. And to make it even worse, the culture they grow up in tends to have disdain for for people who do look at it differently, in the sense that, if you take an FBI agent and the average all-source CIA analyst, or even in wherever in the Pentagon, then what you can see is that they would look at each other and one would say, the FBI guys are always like, what do we do? Who do we arrest? Where's the crime? Right? What's to happen here? And more often than not, the analysts they know every nuance, every detail, every history of whatever the issue is. And those cultures do not always speak the same language. And OD&I has been crucial in overcoming that, both in creating an intel community in the U.S., which we did not have before, and in insisting on common standards. And even as far as going, James Clapper went as far as saying we all need to have the same desktops. So when you open up, you see the same desktop. We can email each other with the same email address. We're not guessing at each other's email addresses. The same global address list. One badge. There's a blue badge for all U.S. intel people. So we go and visit our allies, and you guys over there, you see our blue badge. You go, hey, you're an intel officer in the United States. And you know what that is. But I will mention this. I think there is a danger right now. Not just a danger. It's actually already happened. But ever since 2013, when that traitor Edward Snowden left the country, we've seen a sort of re-siloization of U.S. intelligence. So everyone's gone back into their silos. They've dug back down, burrowed away. And there's just not that same, we moved from a duty to protect and hide to a duty to provide with OD&I. If you know something's going to be a problem, the Japanese are going to attack tomorrow in Pearl Harbor, you better be ringing up your friends across the federal government and call the military services and call the White House, right? You know that Japan's going to attack tomorrow. But now we've moved back to this culture of hiding, where, analysts are no longer encouraged to cooperate with one another and show what they know. So it's really unfortunate.
Well, can I just ask you about that then? So, because I have a perception, and this might be completely wrong, so please put me on the right path if I've got this wrong. But my reading of US intelligence community writ large over the past, shall we say, I'm picking CIA as a starting point, but that's quite arbitrary. But I almost see this kind of wave where, okay, so in the 1950s and 60s, we have the shift to we need to centralize information because as a country, we're worried about state actors and the world as a whole. It's more complex. It's more state orientated. Let's kind of stop thinking Air Force, Navy, Army, economic, political. Let's try and integrate that, and let's try and alter our thinking into a state-led mentality. And you see these departments and policy, and you see State Department, and you see kind of sub-administrations become much more globally active, much more state active. But I wonder if with 9/11, which I think if I remember you rightly, you said that's one of the reasons why you got into this whole thing, is that I wonder if the entire intelligence community had to shift, because it's a massive paradigm change, right? Because up until 9/11, to a certain degree, yes, there's always been individuals and plots and terrorism. There always has been. But 9/11 changed the game, right? 9/11 showed that actually a relatively small, non-state affiliated network can cause such profound problems and damage that you need to kind of retune your entire infrastructure into kind of that non-state actor small group, if you like, that you're training your binoculars not on the state actor or not even the state company, but perhaps you have to reconfigure all of your equipment and sensors for the individual. And I wonder if maybe
very well said.
And I wonder if that pendulum has shifted. And when you say they retreated back in 2013, because obviously, and I'm not advocating anything that's gone on before, but with all the extra attention on civil rights and overreach and things like that, I think in some respects that was going to be an inevitable consequence, right? Because you're turning the binoculars internally, you're turning them on the citizenry. And I wonder if maybe that pendulum of where we're setting that stuff, that's got to produce tension and confusion every time the administration changes, I guess, right?
Well, I do think that there is a more enduring and lasting culture within these organizations that does serve us well. That's one of my questions I often ask. I studied philosophy in undergrad. It's sort of like, what would it look like, tabula rasa? Let's assume that we have no knowledge of this, right? If Howard, Mark, and myself were here today to recommend Intel reorganization, right? How would we do it? And I do think that there are very legitimate reasons for why it would be recreated precisely as it is. Meaning the FBI guys, they have domestic intel. If there's a terrorist threat, they go handle it, right? And if it's a foreign threat, the military handles it, right? And they're outward focused. We don't have the military inward focus here in the United States, which is a blessing and we're all grateful for, right? And that's what the way our Constitution was set up. But I think there's sort of this lingering question, which is simply, if you take the fact that you're going to take the average person that wants to serve his country in the U.S., assuming he has all of his clearances, approvals, whatever. Let's say he's a soldier or a civilian at CIA, or he's an NSA guy, or he's law enforcement, like both of you were, right? Maybe he's at the FBI or a local police officer. Would any U.S. citizen rationally not want him to have information crucial to our nation's survival? Yeah, and I think when we ask that question, the answer is so intuitive. It's like, of course we would, we'd give him everything he needs, right? He's just a guy who wants to protect the country. But once you get into the sort of culture that we're in now, which, the pendulum does swing internally, there's always this tension, kind of the old ghosts of the FBI, CIA rivalry comes up again, right? With Snowden, because suddenly you can't trust anybody, right? I've sort of, mocked, but hopefully in a way to prove a point on LinkedIn, this sort of zero trust framework the DoD, advertises, right? So you walk into the Pentagon, I was just there with the congressional committee maybe 2 or 3 months ago. And the first thing you see is zero trust, with ominous images of people that are not good, right? And it seems so Stalinistic to me that here in the most free world in the United States, where we thrive and require openness to operate, right? And we require trust and community and all those things that we fight for. The most trusted people are hearing not to trust one another. But that's what happens when this sort of, I will call them this, and I don't mind them hearing it, the counterintelligence zealots, right? Sort of the people who, there's a ghost underneath every bed, every person's half bad, that sort of narrative. I learned something from Admiral Sharp, who was one of my mentors, his former director of NGA. He taught us in one of our classes what he calls the good American rule. And he says, in my experience, 99 out of 100 Americans you meet are well-intentioned. They're here to serve and they want to know how to contribute. He said maybe, and he actually didn't say what that 1 out of 100 was, but comparing it to what we're discussing now, I would just say, I would have the same insight. And I would say that I don't think, let me say it this way. Let's assume, I don't know if he was, let's assume Snowden was some sort of plant, right? From planet Klingon or whatever, to use a Star Trek term, right? From the evil empire. I don't think whoever arranged that, if they did, could have imagined the degree of destruction they did. I mean, I don't know what data he got or whatever. Maybe he got none of it. Who knows? But the question is, why are we still penalizing ourselves for not having detected him earlier? Why have we closed down information silos between our 18 agencies? And why are we now dismantling ODNI, which is simply there to ensure that these agencies do share data with one another, with trusted Americans?
You talked about information and intelligence. I break things down to basics because I'm a kind of a simple guy and I like take it.
Hey, I'm with you there, Howard. I'm with you there. We'll leave the big thoughts to Mark and Carmen.
Yeah. Speaking language I can understand. But there's data. Data we turn into information by creating products, be it written language or video films or photographs, some structure that the human mind can understand. But I guarantee you, if I had a room of analysts, and I've done this, all trained within the same organisation, on the same course with the same level of experience, if I gave them the same information pot or data pot, I would get, if there were 20 analysts, I'd get 20 nuanced versions. There'd be different intelligence products. And that certainly happens across agencies with the same information. What you're talking about, the different cultures, the different histories, the management directives, the legal controls, they come up with different intelligence products. So you end up starting with a universal language, data in this case, and you end up with every language in the world because each agency has its own language. So kind of this, in our case, MI5 might be speaking French, MI6 are speaking Swahili, law enforcement are speaking something else. And the third point I'd make here that links into this is these silos of agencies, they are necessary. They're just a byproduct of how we have to run things to make it manageable. But society and the world doesn't work like that. Data's data. You mentioned the open source angle. Everybody can access data these days, and it's used not just for law enforcement or the military or defense. It's used by businesses. It's used by communities. It's used by every agency in the world. And it's global data. So you almost need a fusion center that doesn't just bring these centers together because you're still keeping the same restrictions and cultures in that box. You need a group of analysts who are actually given free rein to go out and do proper horizon scanning and saying, look at all data. And this is where you start looking at AI, shall we say. Look at all the data that we can with no remit to find anything other than something really generic like defend the USA. And let it go fishing and see what it brings up. And 99% of it might be rubbish. But the one idea that you'd never thought of in all your agencies, we miss because of our cultural straitjackets, might be the one that changes the world and saves you from disaster and gives you an opportunity to succeed in the widest possible terms. Mark and I have done this in an agency, and it worked for us.
Well, absolutely. And I'd love to hear about your experience with that. It's one of those things where I think that there's sort of, I think, when we look at intelligence, has to be a fundamental question, which is there a rational reason to divide people's portfolios at this day and age? Is there a rational reason, right? That Howard only gets the blue information, Mark gets the red information, Carson gets the black and white information. Because, there's a great book called Open Source Intelligence in a Networked World by Anthony Alcott from Georgetown University. And he notes that, I forget the exact numbers, it's something like 80% of the information collected by the U.S. intelligence community never sees anyone's eyes, right? So there simply aren't enough analysts to look at all of it. Back to your point, Howard, about perhaps letting an AI, warn us. Though I will say that, I remain stuck on this train of insisting, in no small part due to Alan Turing, who is one of my personal heroes from you guys over there in the UK, that we've yet to achieve artificial intelligence. I often tease my friends who have billions of dollars in these hedge funds that say, I have an AI firm. And I say, what's it doing? And what they fundamentally mean is LLM, they're word calculators, right? They're not actually investing in AI as it meant pre-2023.
Even that software, it can't search all data. It's only searching one pot of historical data. Therefore, it's already crippled. No matter how clever it is, you can't run a machine on data it doesn't have.
Well said. And it's even within the to your point about sort of how these agencies view them differently and how they might view them when they're together or when somebody has access to the same data. It's sort of, I think of it as like dividing puzzle pieces, right? Like the FBI might have 10 pieces, over the Pentagon they've got 10 and the CIA has 10. None of them can solve the problem without working together, right? And so I think it's crucially important that if there's one lesson we continue to sort of remember and push forward, it's that with the proper protections, all trusted people within the federal government need to have access to the same data. You sort of have these funny things that will happen in the Pentagon. Like I was a supervisor, an acting division chief for mission assurance. And you get these requests that say these things are so silly. It's sort of like, if I ask, hey, Mark, does Howard have permission in his current role or need to know about both China and Russia, or is he only allowed to know about one? And you think, well, wait, how can you divide that? Like, the world is not disconnected. Complexity theory and quantum theory prove how interconnected all this is, and even international relations theory. I think that, academics would have a heart attack if they saw how much we subdivide information for quote unquote security. Yet, even, to my point, or to really Tony Alcott's point, really, if every analyst in the U.S. government, let's say even every citizen, all 350 million of us, had access to the same data the IC has, it would take us thousands of years to read it all.
When you were talking about kind of the whistleblowing, the retreat to silo, the things like that, I think, and AI, I want to kind of ask you some questions about that, because I think when I spoke of the IC or the intelligence community's refocus on the individual, let's just say for sake of argument, we call all of the intrusive technology the magic mirror. And let's say since 1950 to 2000, the magic mirror was largely pointed at foreign adversaries, maybe some internal adversaries that were kind of, it might be secessionists, might be domestic terrorists. So I'm not forgiving me, I'm not sure what the US example would be. But the magic mirror was pointed nowhere near, shall we say, the base population. And then for 9/11, for quite valid reasons, you could perhaps say, well, actually, we need to refocus that magic mirror internally. There's a degree of intrusion that's required for safety. I think the difficulty with that is, and as you were telling me about it, I get the sense from you're a deeply loyal person, and the notion of betrayal is very far from you, and you are quite angry with people who haven't taken that duty as seriously. And I'll be honest with, but I have a sense that I've worked with, Howard takes his duty seriously, as do I. I have people who have come to me in the past who are not from the police, who go, oh, what do you do? I'm in the police. It's like, oh, okay, is it Big Brother? Is it are you into the fascist thing? Do you like the power? Do you like the control? And I've sometimes struggled because I want to tell them, like you said, your mentor told you, 99% of people I've ever worked with, it doesn't matter if it was police, security, military, 99% of people, I believe, will use the magic mirror appropriately. Because me and Howard have had access to some incredibly intrusive materials, surveillance, people's phone downloads, their correspondence. And I'll be honest, and Howard may come in a minute with his view on this, but I think that I have, even in the most private of institutions where we've had access to the most sensitive of material, and I mean from a privacy sense, I don't mean from a state security sense, we were never that important. But in terms of stuff, seeing people in some very compromising situations, I have never seen anybody take advantage or misuse. It does happen. There are abuses, but those abuses are detected. So one of the points I want to come back to, you said about maybe we should look at this crazy siloing, dividing you. You're a Russia guy, you're a China guy, and we should move that away from that. I think that the one thing is access. I think we should broaden the access. But one of the things that has stopped the abuse, I think, is twofold. First of all, it's the training and indoctrination. We select the right people, right? You were trained, you were indoctrinated, you were brought in, you rushed to duty because of what happened. And the US got you in, and you got the right person in the right place doing the right thing. And in the UK policing, for the same thing, it shows you why the vetting matters, why the recruitment matters. In other words, you recruit the people who care and are honour bound, and then some of it takes care of itself. Occasionally that system will fail. Occasionally people will, for whatever reason, payment or whatever malign reason, they will abuse a system. At that point, I think you have to have safeguards, because the other thing that a lot of people don't realise about policing is there are lots of internal safeguards in the police. First safeguard is your colleagues. If your colleagues witness you doing anything untoward, it may, report you, and there'll be internal functions there. In terms of digital systems, in terms of our magic mirrors, all of our systems are logged. I can't just go into a database and look up my, prospective partner's new best friend because I'm curious. Every single thing I ever keyed in, there's a log. And there's an entry. And if questions are ever raised, that's recountable. You can have a look at that. So I absolutely support your idea of widening up the access. But I also think we need to think about the more broader concepts of there has to be accountability within those systems. So greater access, but greater logs. But we also need to think about the magic mirror when things change, because Howard and I have spoken to people on this podcast. You may not have a chance to see it, but we spoke to a guy called Konstantin, who is a Russian citizen who he grew up in a very different situation where the information infrastructure and the magic mirror is used very differently, where the police are fundamentally corrupt. And I think you and I, we can't even begin to imagine our magic mirrors and our colleagues ever turning on our citizenry.
That's so well said. And, I often told people, and when people ask me about, Section 702 of FISA, on Capitol Hill, I was working foreign affairs, but, as people got to know my background, I got peppered with national security and intel questions, right? And people and congressmen and senators are, I think, rightfully concerned about the concept of their privacy being violated. I understand and relate to that. What I don't understand is their assumption that the person that would be violating it would be the federal government, intelligence community, or police officers. It turns out that, we all click these little buttons when we go to a website, terms of consent, terms of agreement, all of these things, right? That are patently absurd boilerplate that say, yeah, you can, monitor all my stuff. And now we're putting our problems into AIs and chatbots and asking about private medical questions or about, colleagues or things. And all that data is very expressly stated to be going back to corporations. So as I used to tell people, and as you'll hear from lawyers in the Pentagon, if people are worried about the privacy of their data, they need to worry about Big Blue, not Big Brother. And Big Blue is these corporations that have far more data on all of us than Uncle Sam does. I mean, poor Uncle Sam, as you were saying, not only has his workforce been cut in half due to Doge and some of those other things right now, but there's so many layers of oversight. So the chances of anybody violating Americans' civil rights from the intelligence community, I would dare say, is below 1%, far below 1%. People have this image that when you get in there, we're looking, as you would say, the magic mirror turned on the U.S. My experience is that, even the domestic law enforcement guys, nobody has that mirror turned on the U.S., nor have they since 9/11. What FISA and other things have enabled is that if you have foreigners visiting the United States who make questionable phone calls, and questionable determined, albeit by, sort of broad categories, right? You have sort of like the guys that eventually did the hijacking on 9/11. They were calling back home to, who knows, or Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, and they were already on a terrorist watch list. Then that data is collected and law enforcement is warned. But those aren't U.S. citizens, right? So, I think that it is one thing. I think ICE is sort of a separate issue, but the U.S. intelligence community has its hands full with foreign threats, so.
Carson, that's a really good point. For me, that was the best point that we've made in this discussion amongst many good ones. One of the things that stands out to me is, as you say, one, I have an issue with public servants of any ilk not being accountable to the system that the public creates. Why should their phone calls be private? They may need to be behind levels of security so that only authorized people with the correct access for the correct reasons are looking, but it makes me laugh when they bleat on about this, and yet they're at home where they're, even with all the security scanning and precautions that are put in place, we have in the UK politicians that have been using these various alternative unprotected platforms for communications, just as some of the US politicians have been doing, because they're not experts. They're human beings, or their families do it. There are so many points in the system to leak data that why worry about it? You're better off just not, saying, look at what you want. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm working, or if I do make a mistake, I accept you'll fix it behind the scenes and I'll apologize. It doesn't have to be this big stick, the big brother. The other thing is, I think what everybody misses, and this is the point I wanted to get to, like you say, governments are the poor relations in the data field. We don't have the time or the resources or the interest to actually exploit and mine all the data that the life of the world is creating right now. The real data miners and the real exploiters of the full set of data are global corporations who are not bound by US or UK or any other nation's law necessarily. They're not bound by the ethics. They're not bound by loyalties to nations or to principles or to religions or to any kind of other standard of human behavior. And so that's where we need to be thinking of, where do we need to protect our data from?
Well said. So well said. And
you think, why are you talking about this? It's like a fraction of 1% of the real risk here. And yet you're completely blind to the real risk of data sharing globally, which is a necessary and inevitable function of internet and other traffic.
Absolutely.
Howard, let me push back a little bit, though. So what I would say is, I see where you're coming from, but here's where I think the asymmetry is. Just as a point in principle, I agree with both you and Carson. There are private sector entities that hold far more data than the intelligence community have. I accept that without reservation. Carson, I hope you forgive me for using this phrase, but I remember during I think it was the first strike, one of my friends, he was teasing one of his American colleagues. Don't think he was a Marine, I think he was Army, but they said that the difference between you guys and us guys is you have all the gear and no idea, I think was the phrase.
Oh dear.
And I think what we're talking about here is I think the private sector has all the gear, as in they have the best magic mirrors, but they have no idea because they leverage that magic mirror to sell us more stuff. I think the pushback is, in some respects, to say the US intelligence community is at a disadvantage, I don't want to labour that point too much because you've got a fair bit going for you. You know what I mean? That your magic mirror is not insignificant. There is definitely a magic mirror there. And I think that the issue is that, so from a citizen point of view, who do you push back against and how do you push back? In some respects, I can't stop. Let me put it a different way. Just forgive me. I'm talking about this in a clumsy way. I don't use Facebook. I did. I came off years and years ago. However, I know that sometimes all the people I know on Facebook, you can generate a profile about me, even though I'm not there, through all my friends and colleagues and blah, blah, blah. You can do all that there and all the rest of it. So I can't boycott Facebook, even though in some ways I might be being tagged in Facebook photos, might be mentioned in Facebook posts. Even if I completely boycott Facebook, I have no ability to influence Facebook's ability to collect and use information on me. The same can be said sometimes on a state level from an intel point of view. And I think this is maybe where, and Carson, you're going to be able to speak to this far more eloquently and from a position of expertise than I can. As a complete layperson idiot on the subject, I've seen a tension in civil liberties kind of interpretation is that, and this is a crude oversimplification, it's going to be full of bugs and wrong. So, but try and see the spirit of what I'm trying to say here, is that I think the concern comes from that the US the intelligence community has this magic mirror. Who uses the magic mirror is not clear. What the magic mirror can do is not clear. And what are the safeguards on misuse of the magic mirror? And I think that's what generates. And I agree with both of you. I think there's a lot of hype and hysteria because people go, 1984, Carson's going to be pressing a button and an LLM is going to generate a profile on Mark Lockwood saying, he spends too much time watching TV and he eats too much pizza and all that type of stuff. And maybe that magic mirror might be doing that right now. I think this is where governments can work harder to be more transparent about what the capability is and the intent. Because in the private sector example, the capability and intent is completely invisible and nobody tries to pry open that door.
I wouldn't use the term magic mirror. The term I would use is, what are the legal tools of spying? To make it very explicit, right? Because you hear Americans say, and you read conspiracy theories, I'm being spied on or someone's being spied on, or the government's spying on us, right? That sort of fear and sentiment, I think we just need the media primarily to be more honest about it, because to Howard's point earlier, Howard, you mentioned, nobody would be doing all of this. We don't have enough time and energy to look at American citizens, what they're doing, what they're up to, what not. And aside from that, if there's a need to, right? Like, let's say that my neighbors next door, let's say they were carrying bombs and maps and things that look very suspicious, and I call the FBI and say, hey, this looks really sketchy, or the DC police. They have to go before a FISA court, lawyers in front of a FISA court to get a warrant. A judge has to approve it. His judgment is reviewed by a separate court of quality control judges. It's all reviewable by the U.S. Supreme Court should they make a mistake, and if my neighbors turn out to be innocent, right? And so, there's all these layers of constitutional protections built in because of not just the First Amendment, right? Free expression. Over here, the Fourth Amendment, you can't have your data unreasonably seized or searched, right? Which needs to be made more express by Congress with respect to the internet world. But the truth is that the federal government faces so many obstacles to sort of performing in its function. There's actually a disincentive to do your function. In a sort of weird irony. It reminds me of what happened during COVID, where it was coming after, all those anti-police things that happened, with the tragic death of George Floyd up in Minnesota, right? But police officers were literally scared to get out of their cars and do their jobs, right? And I think the problem we have with always making the government the bad guy in these scenarios is that you actually create a disincentive for people to do their job. And their job is catching bad guys when it comes down to it, right? Whether they're foreign, whether it is my neighbors next door and they were up to shenanigans, that's their job, catching bad guys. And Americans just need to remember the federal government is very, very hamstrung if it ever were to look at their information. And the entire FISA 702 thing is public. All the protections are there if they Google it, right? There's no sort of wizard behind the curtain or whatever, right? And the other thing I'll say about this, and I wanted to mention this, is that there's two things. One, I wanted to mention something about open societies and Karl Popper. And the second thing I was to go back to companies and corporations that Howard mentioned. But there's a great book called The Open Society and Its Enemies, by Karl Popper, who again is one of yours. And I hasten to add that Liddell Hart is, to my mind, the best strategist the world has seen yet. People talk about Sun Tzu, but, Sun Tzu, I think, is for elementary students. Liddell Hart talks about military strategy, the indirect strategy, not just in achieving your objective, but as a matter of an approach to life, right? Just truly great. But to reference the Karl Popper thing, he talks about the advantages and disadvantages of having an open society, relative to the other option. And he was writing, during the Cold War and after the Cold War. And you look at it and say, okay, so that, people often say, and you hear this today, well, China has the advantage of complete state control, right? President Xi wakes up and he wants, 200 more, fifth generation fighter planes. He can order it done that day. And that the Chinese people will be making it happen. In the US, it has to be, congressional authorizations, blah, 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 all these oversight things. But Karl Popper highlights something that I think we have very much forgotten in the United States, which is that the best virtue of open societies is the dialogue and open exchange, the free exchange of ideas between one another that make an open society so dynamic. It's why you see people who are in open societies create the best scientific achievements. Some people, think it's sort of cultural arrogance to say, democracies create the best technology or something, right? As though there's some correlation between judging other societies. The reality is that when any human is given, the liberties to be themselves and to explore ideas, they generate better ideas with their fellow citizens. But to your point, Mark, with Facebook, it's funny. I talked. I won't mention the name, but a senior government official from the military, he had said on Facebook he was going to delete his account, because lack of privacy and whatnot. And I told him about Karl Popper in a public post. And I just said, you need to think about what we as the community here, right? The online community of the country will be missing out on if you don't add your voice to the cacophony of voices here, the public forum where we hear ideas, we evaluate them, we all make our own independent decisions. But there's an element of truth that we really can't reach in democracies unless we're willing to have those open discussions. I know, Howard, you mentioned the allegations about Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, and some of those guys, indirectly. And I just think it's so silly. People want to get upset about, did someone make a call about XYZ or use this app or that app? The bottom line is, are they doing a good job? Are they patriotic people who care about their country? And by all accounts, they're very, very patriotic. And I have to say with Pete Hegseth as well, he gets such bad coverage in the liberal media. And I've told my Democratic friends that it's really poorly advised because for the first time I don't know that there's another time in U.S. history, we have a soldier that, he reached the field grade rank of major who has advanced all the way to becoming Secretary of Defense. And he knows what it's like to be, boots on the ground in Afghanistan and Iraq. He knows what it's like to be called up for civil disturbances or to be called up for humanitarian relief and disaster assistance. And he cares deeply about the country. And he doesn't have this sort of interest forsworn to corporations like you'll see with some flag and general officers that are retired. But the second thing I just want to mention real quick is with this deal with multinational corporations, right? And how they have access to more data about us than anyone else. I think there's a corollary problem there. It's not strictly an intel problem, but I think it is very much a national security problem, which is that you have like the Fortune 500 and many of the top earning firms in the world paying 0% in taxes, which is not sustainable. Period, right? So, it's not a matter of like, oh, maybe they should be tax-free, maybe they shouldn't. No. Someone needs to say very clearly and without reservation, all countries will go broke unless corporations pay something in taxes. Now, the amount you can look at and debate, but there have been studies that show by some UK firms and by the UN, the International Monetary Fund, if you charge a corporation 18% or less, that's the kind of the break-even point. they'll pay it happily and write it off. If you go above that, let's say you want to charge 30, 40%, it's cheaper for them to hire law firms to avoid paying anything. So I think there needs to be some realism about that, but we do need companies to be more patriotic. And I often joke with friends, to companies who think it doesn't matter who's in power, let's see what happens were the US and other democracies to be overtaken by China and see how well, capitalism thrives in communist China. There's no such thing as ownership, right? So when people joke that these guys have no vested interest in sort of the outcome of these geostrategic things, which I think in many cases is true, they're strictly in it for the profit. And I do think there's a lot of them are still sort of hedging their bets on who will win between China and the US. But that's a different issue. But over to you, Howard.
You make some good points. And one of the things that kind of made me smile was you mentioned Pete Hesketh, and I don't know the guy. I'm not competent to comment. But you also mentioned this idea of being openness when you were talking about the senator, which I agree with. You've got to have a voice. And what amazed me with Hesketh, whether or not I agree with who he is, what he is, how he behaves, and all the rest of it, this idea that he would close down the press corps of the Pentagon. So, and this is a guy who, as well as his military experience, came from a career in media, in communicating and sharing, and you can see that in the way he behaves all the time. From a media personality point of view, he looks and speaks in that way. He doesn't come across as what you might call a typical senior military officer with all those years of experience up to far more senior ranks. And I'm not decrying his experience and his ranks whatsoever, but you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And I think you're right about the issue with the press. I mean,
you just think that's contraindicating or a contrary factor to what he's trying to do. He's trying to control the message. And it's like, no, if you want this open society and to promote democracy, be prepared to be challenged. I'm a great believer. Sometimes you don't have, it's like the military situation. Sometimes as a commander, you just need people to go out and do the that you ask them to do and don't ask questions. We haven't got time to debate it. That's Absolutely. The real world. But any other time, the best commanders or the best managers I have ever worked with, any agency, any nation, any sector of society, have been the ones who've been open to encouraging new ideas and fresh ideas, even the outliers, that will help inform their decision making, even though after the fact, the buck still stops with them and they say, thank you, everybody. And I've decided this is my course of action, even if it's a different, directing a different Intel product. But that communication is the very thing that brings up good ideas. And yet most managers these days in government seem to be the ones who silo it down. Business are pretty good at opening it up because they've got one goal, make money. What I would say, I agree with what you're saying on tax wholeheartedly. I pay more tax as a UK pensioner, ex-law enforcement of mediocre rank, just on a law enforcement pension, not some mega private sector pension scheme. What I would say to these companies, it's not just about the 18% break-even point. It's also about what are you contributing to society, either in my country or globally? Because if where's the idea for them to have some element of duty to society the same way that we all talk of duty and doctors do and nurses and road sweepers,
So
they're
well
the working
said.
stiffs that build the glue of the world, not privileged people who make money from destroying the world. And in my view, they are destroying the world. Don't get me wrong, some of them do some good. I look back to some of the rich people back in the Victorian and Edwardian eras who established national libraries and national health services before these things came along. They were philanthropists in the truest word. And you can find them all around the world. And I look at these guys today doing what they're doing, taking this money and manipulating through politics and through information, their ability to collect more money without control, and think, regardless of whether you've got morals, where's your duty?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it truly is, it's what strikes me is the distinction between companies now and what they were in World War II, right? There's a phenomenal book by Arthur Herman called Freedom's Forge, and it's about how American companies came to the rescue.
They stepped up.
They stepped up, instead of making cars, they were suddenly making jets. Instead of, they were making tanks instead of trucks. And they were willing to do it because their leadership and their CEOs were patriotic. They realized we owe a duty here, and it is a moral and ethical duty to me. I mean, I would ask people, is it fair for, similarly for a police officer here, Howard, to pay, here's probably 40%, even after he's retired, of his stipend to the state, and yet have, the number of, 1 and 2 oil companies in the U.S. pay $0. I mean, it's just a matter of, and, now that we have so much debt, it is a matter of sustaining and saving the companies. And we have to sort of have the courage of our convictions. I think one of the interesting things, we were talking about policy earlier, or Mark had mentioned we'll probably get there. And I think one of the interesting things is the degree to which laws are enforced and are made in a democracy, and then they're not enforced, right? I mean, this happens over and over again, in the U.S. You'll get consensus, phenomenal law passed, and you have to ask, where's the enforcement mechanism? And with the U.S., the IRS is the enforcement arm, and unfortunately, the current administration cut them in half. So there's not even people to collect the taxes. It's sort of a make money while you can type thing.
I think it's not just the enforcement mechanism. I also think, and this goes back to what you were saying about if the public only knew the barriers the intelligence community had. I think we've had this conversation with other intel colleagues. I have the impulse to say what we need is the TV show Law and Order. We need like a Law and Order for intel, right? That kind of shows how things. Do you know what I mean? The kind of. I think the closest we ever got was maybe The Wire with some of the barriers in like Title III and things like that. But I think even then, the problem is if you had a show like Law and Order for intel, I don't know who would watch it beyond the intel stuff, right? So I'm not so sure if that would actually do anything.
It would be so boring. People would just turn it off. They'd be seeing analysts with books. I have like a mini library here reading books. How did we win World War II? How do we deceive the evil Nazis?
But
and then applying it to modern day, there's just nothing unfortunately sexy about it.
But I think you've hit the nail on the head. So like both me and Howard have similar libraries. When I go book hunting for intelligence books, like when I go to it doesn't matter if it's the oldest antique store in the world or if it's brand new, if I find a section that's got intelligence books, I'm going to argue probably at least half to 80% of it is about traitors, right? It's about spies. What I'm saying is it's intel, I think, has become synonymous with either betrayal or surveillance. Essentially, that's what people associate with the word, I would say. When we say the word police, if I say I'm reading a book, if you tell me you're reading a novel and it's a police novel, I can probably infer that, okay, there's going to be a bad guy and there's going to be something to catch the bad guy. And it's going to be a breadcrumb trail. But if I tell you that I'm reading a book about an intelligence agency, I think most people who are not from our background get drawn into, it's smoke and mirrors, secrets and lies, backs to cloak and dagger, instantly draws this veil of mistrust. And I think, and that's what I was alluding to earlier on, I was saying, I think the challenge, and I say that when I say challenge, I want to put on the record that I actually think the US has been one of the most transparent in its attempts to kind of, I'm saying over decades, right? This podcast probably wouldn't exist. A lot of Howard's and I's training material probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't how transparent many of our US intelligence colleagues have been about technique. And I don't mean about anything inappropriate. There's nothing kind of operationally sensitive or tradecraft. But what I'm saying is the US for decades has had a tradition of share. We do it this way. Do you do it that way? Far more than a lot of other Western nations, to be frank.
Yeah, and I think we've had Sue Gordon, the former PDD&I under President Trump's first administration, and General Hayden before come out and say, and he was a 4-star general, saying, we're in a democracy here. The U.S. people don't have to. It turns out they don't have to pay for spy agencies, right? Like, things that, the culture we have now, the country we have now, none of it can be taken for granted. And so Sue Gordon specifically has highlighted, if we don't have a base of support among the American people, they literally can just get rid of all intelligence agencies in the United States. Yet, unfortunately, not all of the people who maybe would like to do that in the U.S. are aware of how naked and vulnerable we would be in the world, right? I mean, prior to World War II, we didn't know the Nazis had these horrific gas chambers because we didn't have an intel organization. General Donovan was phenomenal, but he was not large enough. His organization and the OSS was not large enough to get everything done. So I really agree with you, Mark. Transparency is necessary. As they say in the U.S., intelligence has no constituents. senators and congressmen call their constituents the people they represent back home, and there's no state that's sort of like an intel state. So you have to sort of rely on the goodwill of the American people.
Can I just mention a couple of things? One, you mentioned World War II and the ethics of the private sector. That happened over here with companies like Rolls-Royce, the engines and things like that.
Oh,
but
excellent.
A good example in America. For my many sins, one of them is I own a 1941 Packard. Built into Detroit, but for the European, it actually went to South Africa, so it's right-hand drive, so it fits the UK. Now, Packard, at that time, in 1941, they'd gone through the 30s and 40s and were, shall we say, a bit like Cadillac, the Rolls-Royce of cars, or Duesenbergs.
They're beautiful. They're absolutely beautiful.
I love this thing to bits. It's a white elephant to me, but I do love it. But during the war, they turned their production to war production, and they had to commit to that virtually totally. The consequence was that those companies who had capacity to carry on making cars and develop and research that market, as well as the war effort, and I'm not blaming them for doing that, were so far advanced after 1945 that Packard couldn't compete. And within roughly a decade, this Rolls-Royce, this major manufacturing company, had disappeared totally.
Oh, that's tragic. Of the books I'm reading, I've been sort of since 2017, the Naval Intelligence asked me to get a little certificate in artificial intelligence. So I got one from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And, without exception, every book that they have referred us to, and that I'm currently reading, I'm looking at one right now by Bob Coker and Stephen Gagliasso, called Quantum and Picture. And there's a subsequent, that's sort of the entry-level graduate school one. And there's a bigger book, I do really wish this camera was working, but called Picturing Quantum Processes by Bob Coker and Alex Kissinger. And they happen to work for Quantinuum, which is based in the UK, and which is hands down, without exception, the company that's leading cutting edge quantum research. And, as people often say in the United States, AI was the hot trend in the teens, meaning 2013 to maybe 19. But for investors, it's sort of like a done deal, right? It will evolve as it will. But quantum and, quantum theory and quantum information theory, quantum communication, and the things that will come subsequent to that are sort of where the next big breakthroughs will come from. And it's always interesting to me when I look at something like information theory, and it turns out there's someone referencing Alan Turing, like in the great book Turing's Cathedral, which interestingly, speaking of wealthy people, would not have been published without the donation and the intellectual interest of the owner of Amazon. Yeah. He wanted to know more about how Turing and how was this computer thing created to begin with. And so he paid some researchers and hired some scientists to go back and look at the history of it. Turing's Cathedral is a great book. But when it comes to information data science, our UK partners are definitely on the cutting edge. So I'm grateful you're on our team.
Yeah. The other thing is you were talking about this idea of a blue badge for analysts and intel operatives. I really like that as kind of a glue. If you said military officer rank or police officer or doctor or nurse, there may be variations globally, but they all have a certain status. Anybody, you could go to the darkest place in Africa, China, Russia, America, in the back of beyond or in the major metropolis. You know what you're talking about. You say it and people know what you mean. They don't for intel and analysis. But one of the things I've always thought about is being more creative and more blue sky thinking. We accept that we've got all these restrictions of how these people have to operate in their daily work routine within their organizations and how they become influenced by cultures. I've always been keen on trying to break down those barriers, not only to make those individuals think within their organizations a bit more creatively and maybe go a bit beyond without breaking any, rules or procedural processes of sharing or whatever. But one of the things I got into not long after getting into US-driven law enforcement and intelligence analysis was the idea of professional bodies, groups of these professionals who would network and develop standards for a profession. And I ended up as vice president of the biggest one in the world and serving on the boards of many at the time.
Oh, wonderful.
And the trouble was, but here am I'm just a British guy contributing. And we were from all over the world. They were truly international. And we had quite a bit of influence back in the sort of around the millennium, the early 2000s. I remember working in the US a lot, designing national intelligence programs. What then was the Fiat training program that was the basic training for all law enforcement, but also involved colleagues and friends from the armed services. So it went far beyond just law enforcement. But what I found, and I ended up leaving all of them, I wish them the best, but they would create exactly the same stovepipes that our organisations did. And I'll give you a really good example. I won't name the organisations in detail, because it's not about picking on them. But one was called something intelligence analysts, and then the next biggest one was called something crime analysts. And I knew all the people in both, and I was a member in both.
Oh, interesting.
And I called them together and said, look, I'm confused. You're both law enforcement. What's the difference between intel analysis and crime analysis? And the intel people said, well, we look at crime data, but we look at other data as well. So we're cleverer, shall we say. We've come up with a better quality product than crime analysis. And I spoke to the crime analysts and said, what do you look at? Well, our focus is crime, but clearly we look at other intel and information as well to come up with an informed judgment. So I said, so both of you are looking at intel and crime analysis data, if you want to make those artificial subdivisions, to come up with analytical products to serve law enforcement. Yeah. So you're all doing the same job. Why
exactly?
And the answer really, if they were honest, was we've created a little niche market here with a group of members, and that's giving us power and influence, and the individual board members got credibility above and beyond, shall we say, their true abilities. They had more status because they were an officer of a professional body, maybe than just as, Joe Average or Julie Average because they were men and women in their own organisations. So it behoved them, just for personal bragging rights almost, to have different organisations and create subdivisions. And I honestly think it's actually an anthropological function. It's what human beings do to get themselves power and influence, regardless of it being organisational or driven by military or law enforcement constraints or monetary gain. I just think it's about power and control. So I walked away from all those organisations because they were an antithesis. They were antithetical to the values that they were setting up and trying to promote. But hey, what do I know?
Well, hey, Howard, you're onto something there. And I tell you, you make such a good point about how, at the end of the day, they're all people, right? Whether they're studying this or they're studying that, they're in the UK, they're patriotic UK citizens, and I would say that, I was telling to Carmen and some other colleagues the other day, I really think that in the United States, there needs to be a more public culture about our intelligence community. Because we're officers, right? And people, unfortunately, the intelligence community does not do a good job of telling people 99% of intelligence community analysts are overt, meaning their paychecks come in the mail, right? Their LinkedIn says they work at, DIA, the Pentagon, CIA, whatever, FBI, and it says their job, right? And there's no policy prohibiting that, right? It's a different issue whether or not there should be, but there currently is not, and there's no statute requiring it. And it's because we live in an open society, right? And we all are one country and one people. But I mentioned it would be good if there was sort of a more public culture of it, because I've seen in the intel community and in government what you're talking about, Howard, where there are distinctions that don't make it different, that end up being things that stop information sharing, or they stop people cooperating together, right? And if people thought of themselves first as a member, a U.S. intelligence community officer, right? Before they told you, I'm from ODNI or DIA or CIA or FBI, that was their identity, right? And I do think that the ODNI, I think it would be great if in 5 or 10 years, they were the only organization or agency allowed to recruit people. And I say that because if everybody knows, hey, we're all coming from the same place, dude. Like you, me, we're former Marines, we're jarheads, whatever. We got into intel after we retired. And then you sort of get filtered off to whatever agency needs you at the time. But it would highlight that, hey, we're all the same. And we're also highlighting the American people that we're just fellow citizens.
I mean, think of this. My philosophy is every human being from cradle to grave is an analyst. You analyze data every day. That's how we operate as living creatures. That's what makes us different from a stone or a plant. So we're all doing analysis. We may not be trained to do it, but you do it when you pick what clothing you're going to wear, what football team you support or basketball team, what kind of car you decide you want to drive, who you pick as your partner, that kind of thing. And I've always said, look, when you go to school, you get to meet people in school. You'll have the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker will come in, even police officers. And I've seen military officers go out into the public and say, hey, I'm a soldier. I'm a member of the armed services. This is what we do. Come here, go to a show, sit on a gun. And I know it's partly recruiting, but it's a form of outreach. I used to, for a period of about 5 years after I'd retired, I taught in a university. And one of the things I did was outreach, because I was working primarily with law enforcement, but criminologists and intelligence and social sciences in the wider frame. And I would go out and get engaged with not just people who are looking to join any university for an academic degree, but also schools for secondary education, which is different to how it is in the US, but basically teenage education. This podcast that Mark, and this was Mark's creation, not mine. He just came up with the idea and I said, yeah, I'll help you. Look at the guests we have. The whole point of our podcast, we can nerd out all day. But by design, deliberately we choose people from a massive range of backgrounds and we make them accessible to Joe Public. We aren't too bothered about fellow Intel professionals listening to us, but because it's open source, I know it's long form, so it's hard to digest compared to today's YouTube videos or, that kind of immediate dopamine hit. Here we are, two fat blokes from Wakefield, or I'm fat, and we have on a former US Marine who's achieved rank within the US Navy and worked at the highest possible level. Who would normally be able to listen to somebody like that having a chat with fellow colleagues from a different profession? Carmen's another one. That's the point. It's about outreach and sharing ideas so that maybe we can plant the seeds for the future for the next generation. It's got to be far more open and deal with society as a whole. Does that make sense?
Oh, it totally makes sense. And you hit a key point on recruiting. Some of these people, you can take the brightest people in the United States, the number one graduates from Harvard and Princeton and Yale, and many of them are not aware that they can choose the FBI, they can choose DHS, they can choose CIA and apply to those career paths. For whatever reason in the US, it does not seem accessible. I was with Sue Gordon at an OD&I recruitment kind of booth in DC back, I forget if it's 2010 or 11. Anyway, but, and people were really startled when they saw an OD&I hiring booth right there with applications for all 16 agencies. They said, can I do that? And these people, Americans, going back to Americans' humility, they don't realize that it's absolutely not just open to them, they're needed, right? We need that interest and that fresh blood with fresh ideas coming into the intelligence community every day.
You're right. And look at American schools. One of the things I always admire, they'll stand up and they will sing the national anthem and put their hand on their chest.
I love that. Yep.
You know what I mean? So
absolutely,
as a culture, as a country, you are indoctrinating your children in having respect and values above and beyond their own personal position. So why not use the opportunities to say, when you get to a career, I want to be a doctor, I want to drive a truck or whatever. Have you ever considered a career in the military or law enforcement or being an intelligence analyst? Because it doesn't have to be in those agencies; it could be in the private sector.
Well, let me just try and circle back to, I think the problem with us three is obviously we know a lot, we care a lot. Carson, first of all, we're going to have you back at some stage. I hope you would consider coming back.
Oh, it's kind of you, of course.
But what I think is important is, I think, as Howard alluded to, is that, and as you've alluded to, Carson, you said, okay, why have these walls? Why have these divisions? It's kind of crazy. It's arbitrary. It's counterproductive. And if it ever worked before, it was a very different world. It doesn't work now. And Howard's right. The Collator's podcast is around because essentially what I've observed is within the intelligence community, through my entire intelligence career, I don't know if you've had similar experiences, but I always had a very lingering imposter syndrome about, do I actually know what intelligence is? Do I deserve the seat I'm in? Am I an intelligence professional or am I just winging it? Am I just kind of going along with the jargon, going along with the process? And what I've learned over my intelligence career, which is, just over 2.5 decades now, is I kind of think that we've learned that all human beings, as Howard said, process information. They get information from lots of different sources. They always think the same thing in very different ways. But actually, sometimes that's a good thing. That cognitive diversity, that difference in approach matters. And so it's great that we're talking to you today. And your thoughts about the open society, really important, because I think when we think about open society, we kind of drift into, okay, are you open about the secrets? Are you coughing to things that goes wrong? Yes, that's part of it. But I would say that one thing the US does well, and it's for US colleagues to come back and tell me I'm wrong, is that whilst I might look at the rivalry in US kind of politics or US intelligence community kind of social media settings, at least you're having that debate in the open, and there's a space for that debate. And you're not always going into, you're an idiot, you're wrong. I mean, there's always going to be a bit of that on social media, don't get me wrong. But what I've witnessed is people like yourself, people like Carmen, you'll have a view, it'll be an informed, educated view, and it'll never be ad hominem. You're never going to call someone out, for anything silly. You're going to say, I passionately believe this because, and you have the space to have that debate. And I think that's absolutely fundamental.
I appreciate it, Mark. There's a paper I published called Why Truth is Out of Fashion on LinkedIn. There's a great quote about the tradition. I believe it's either Cambridge or Oxford. Somebody said the book Why Truth Matters is actually from the UK, some philosophers over there who kind of, similar to Foucault, they look at historical truth and bring it up to the forward and say, what are the different kinds of speech that we have, right? Foucault has a book called Fearless Speech, where he talks about the different kinds of truth. You can tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth. You could be a politician and trying to influence people. Or you can be a citizen just speaking the truth, as Howard and I do, right? And I think that one of the fundamental things here is that the United States has always protected and known that so much of our strength comes from the open society, and anyway, going back to that quote, there's a great quote in that paper from Cambridge where it says, you do need to be polite and respectful of individual, but you can be fiercely aggressive towards their ideas. Meaning, I'm misquoting it, it's there in the paper, but, it's the concept that ideas are meant to be debated. There's no such thing as a finished idea.
I think that's a good place to wind things up, gentlemen. So, Carson, I hope we have you back one day. Thank you for coming onto the pod. I think that was a great start to the conversation, and should time allow and circumstances allow, maybe we can have a few more in the future. So, Howard, is there anything else before we wind it up?
No, from me. It's the first time we've spoken, Carson. I have really enjoyed it. I am not surprised that I've enjoyed it because of your relationship with Carmen and other people who I know and respect. I would love to carry on this conversation in a lot more detail at a future date. And if there's any way we can work to help you in any way, give us a shout anytime. It's been a privilege.
I appreciate it, gentlemen. And thank you for both what you do for the UK and for what you do there. And thank you, Mark, for founding this podcast. We appreciate you. So take care, gentlemen. Thank you.
This episode of The Collators was hosted by Mark Lockwood and Howard Atkin. If you like the podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe. You can find more episodes over at thecollators.com. Thank you for listening.